Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is Grace Bishop alongside T.S. Eliot. How are you doing tonight, Mr. Eliot?
I'm doing well, Grace. How are you doing?
I'm great. Thank you for asking. I wanted to begin this evening by asking you a few questions regarding your famous poem, The Wasteland. To start off, what made you write this poem?
That is a question that I get all the time. Following the destruction of World War I, I knew that changes had to be made around the world, and especially in Europe. The war had uprooted the people, land, and traditions throughout Europe. Due to the way that the war had negatively transformed Europe, I decided to write a poem filled with allusions to demonstrate to my audience the harsh nature of the world. Overall, the goal of The Wasteland was to urge readers to begin to think about the sinful nature and decline of the current world.
Mr. Eliot, you actually just jumped right into my next question, which is going to be, tell me about the use of allusions throughout the poem.
Well, Grace, the subject that the poem is based upon is very dark and can be difficult to describe with ordinary words that other authors may use in writing a novel per se. My intentions in using allusions were to develop ideas and connect to the reader without having to recreate the dark ideas that authors before me had created. My allusions are meant to touch on both the darkest and the least dark elements of the poem.
Can you describe in detail an allusion to a certain author and speak of the effect that this author and his or her work had on the wasteland?
I would love to. The first author that comes to mind is Jesse Weston, author of From Ritual to Romance. Weston's book was published only 2 years before I released The Wasteland and provided me with very insightful information which I began to study and incorporate into the poem. In Chapter 2 of From Ritual to Romance, titled The Task of the Hero, Weston writes about the task of the hero and his or her task in the Holy Grail. The Holy Grail is a very, very difficult subject that scholars have been studying for years, and I found this interesting. Weston writes on page 16, quote, healing the wound of the king himself and removing the woes of the land. This idea is further developed on page 19 when Weston writes, quote, in 3 cases, the misfortunes and wasting of the land are the result of war and directly caused by the hero's failure to ask the question. And, quote, the aim of the Grail quest is twofold. It is to benefit A, the king, and B, the land. 2 pages later, Weston states, quote, the condition of the king is sympathetically reflected on the land. This develops the idea that the goal of the Grail hero is to restore both the health of the king and the land. I implemented this into the poem by alluding to the king, who in the poem is God. In lines 192 and 191 and 192, of The Wasteland, I wrote, quote, musing upon the king, my brother's wreck, and on the king, my father's death before him. In doing so, the audience understands that the king is God and that he has abandoned the people of Europe. In turn, the land has also been uprooted and torn apart.
Can you explain the allusion to the Tarot Pact that Weston writes about in Chapter 6?
Well, throughout Chapter 6 of From Ritual to Romance, Weston explains the symbols of the Grail quest. On page 73, Weston writes, quote, they exist today as the 4 suits of the tarot. I created an allusion to the Tarot Pact in part 2 of the poem to further develop the idea of the Grail quest as a whole. This allows the audience to better relate to the Grail and to understand the theme that I created in the poem. The idea that God's abandonment of the people of Europe caused the land to fall into a state of devastation and the overall condition of the continent to be torn apart.
Thank you. Now, can you describe your interpretation of the Fisher King?
Well, I found the Fisher King to be God. As a result, I used allusions to the king to show the audience that the king, God, had fallen into a bad state and the land had as well. Weston writes on page 120, quote, the fish was sacred to those deities who were supposed to lead men back from the shadows of death to life. Immediately following this, on page 121, Weston writes, quote, God is frequently addressed as Divine Lamgar, Lord of the Net, the nearest equivalent I have so far found to our, quote, Fisher King. Using this information, I developed the idea that the Fisher King was meant to symbolize the Christian God, and I alluded to this king throughout the poem to demonstrate to the audience that God had not fully watched over and protected either his people or the land of Europe during World War I. Further, the first quote struck me very hard, and I used this to show that although the king had allowed the people and land of Europe to fall into a state of devastation, as the Fisher King, he will once again return and lead his people, quote, back from the shadows of death to life. Therefore, I used the allusions to the king in the poem to develop the idea that the Lord had failed to protect the land and people of Europe during the war, but he will return and use his power to fix the destruction which he had allowed.
Mr. Eliot, your use of allusions throughout the wasteland seem to be very powerful and contribute a great deal to the poem.
Thank you, Grace. I really tried to develop the ideas of the poem through the use of allusions, and at the end of the day, Jessie Weston's From Ritual to Romance provided me with information that was very significant to the creation of the poem as a whole, and allowed me to develop a theme that the audience could relate to by the end of the poem.
Well, Mr. Eliot, it was great to get to talk to you. That was very insightful for all of our viewers.
Grace, it was truly, truly great to speak with you tonight. Thank you so much for your time.